Wanted to do a quick addendum to that intro video on civil rights and American politics. Kind of an update, if you will. So, really to account for some of the changes in the executive branch's approach to civil rights since Trump took office for the second time in January of 2025. Big changes at the Department of Justice in terms of how they understand things like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and also some ongoing changes at the level of the U.S. Supreme Court, with so many Trump appointees on that court, creating a supermajority of Republicans. I would say this. The broad understanding of the MAGA movement, Project 2025, President Donald Trump, the broad understanding has been, because civil rights are for everybody. Right, the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause says that you cannot deny people equal protection of the law based on their racial identity, whether you're white, black, Latino, Asian American, indigenous, whatever, right? So that's certainly true. Of course it is. Now, I think the Trump administration 2.0's view is that for far too long, the understanding of civil rights law has been far too geared towards protecting the civil rights of Americans of color, women, members of the LGBTQ community. There's been far too much emphasis on that as the problem, and far too little concern for the civil rights of men and white people and straight people. Right? And look, it's an open-ended conversation that we'll always be having as long as we're a functioning democracy. How should we conceptualize civil rights? It's tricky. It's always going to be contested. We're a large, rowdy, boisterous, and diverse country of well over 300 million people. I think we're close to 350. This stuff's always up for grabs. And the conversation is always moving in new directions. So it's, so in that sense, I totally get it. Yeah, I mean, sort of what stands out to me, right, is recently the Trump administration has said we are going to allow in some refugees from other countries, political refugees, and our primary focus now is going to be on white people from South Africa. That's going to be who we let in because they're such a targeted minority in South Africa. That's open to severe question. But right, he's sort of signaling, this is my new civil rights agenda. What about white people? So, apropos of that, what we've seen is, number one, right, that sort of energy and policy coming from the executive branch through the Department of Justice, because their job is to enforce civil rights law, things like the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. Right, so how they conceptualize civil rights is super important. We'll see that's why it's so important who we elect to the White House, because that shapes the direction of the federal bureaucracy in applying laws. You elect a Republican president, you'll get a Republican focus. You elect a Democratic president, you'll get a Democratic Party focus. All right, so and as I've suggested, not only have we seen that sort of a shift in understanding of civil rights in America coming out of the executive branch, but we've seen a similar sort of directional dynamic coming out of the U.S. Supreme Court, largely because it's a supermajority of Republicans, 3 of them put there by Donald Trump. And I suspect he'll probably get 1 or 2 more before he leaves office in another 2.5 years. We'll see. The big one here, and it's covered in our text, and I believe I've covered it in the slides, right? Shelby County v. Holder, 2013, right, where the Supreme Court decided. So let me go backwards for just a moment. Ever since the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, there was a stipulation that in political jurisdictions where there was a bad history of racial discrimination, those jurisdictions, if they wanted to change any of their voting rules, would need to request that either from the Department of Justice or a federal judge. Pre-clearance for any changes in voting laws and regulations. It's essentially saying, right, that we have a history of some bad actors out there in America, and you're going to get put in sort of a timeout on this issue. If you're one of the jurisdictions that have done better historically, you don't have to seek pre-clearance. All right, you're in sort of a preferred position on that issue. And the court said in Shelby County v. Holder, we're getting rid of that distinction, effectively getting rid of that distinction. That nobody's in the timeout room. And what the court kind of suggested was, at this point, racial discrimination is largely gone, and all the states are in about the same position on race. So, no more sort of punishment for historically bad actors, because that history is behind us. Right, so states and local governments no longer have to seek pre-clearance on changes to voting laws and regulations from the feds. All right, that's quite a blow to the Voting Rights Act, right? Because that pre-clearance mostly applied to southern states where there's a history of bad actions on race. Some say that history is all too present, and this was a wrong-headed decision. But again, right, these things are hotly contested, and, see which arguments you find most persuasive. But that's what the court found to be persuasive in Shelby County v. Holder. So in many ways, many would say an undermining of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And let me really just push ahead right to the present. Really, let's just make this faster than I had intended, because I tend to talk too much. I'm trying to limit that and deal with that problem. Louisiana v. Calais, 2026, where the Supreme Court rules that, so it's a little complicated, but historically, the Voting Rights Act of 65, as amended in 1982, this is mini law school again, that amendment in 1982 created language, authorized by Congress, that effectively means that in states where there's a history of racially polarized voting, right, where whites tend to vote one way, and let's say blacks or other minorities tend to vote a different way for different candidates, a different party, where there's this history of racially polarized voting, the Voting Rights Act in some cases might require creating what are known as majority-minority electoral districts, where minority voters have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choosing, roughly proportionate to their numbers statewide. So to make it relatively simple, right? Let's say that you've got a state with 10 electoral districts, electing members to the House of Reps, 10 of those districts. And let's say that 20% of that state is black and 80% of that state is white. And there's a history of racially polarized voting. Right? What the court said up until this year was that in cases like that, it may be required that you draw those electoral districts such that in 20% of those districts, it's black majority or close to black majority. And in 80% of those districts, it's white majority. In other words, right, of the 10 districts, 2 of them should be black majority or near black majority. And in the other 8, it can be white majority. That may be a requirement in some cases of the Voting Rights Act. That race must be taken into account to ensure that not only do blacks have the right to vote, but that vote can have a meaningful impact on who gets elected. Right? All right. Republicans always hated that interpretation of that language. It's sort of a long-term goal of the conservative movement to reverse that understanding of the Voting Rights Act, and they get their wish with a supermajority Supreme Court made up of 2/3 Republicans half of those justices put there by Trump that said, no. So what we've been saying since 1982 is no longer good law. We're going to revise our understanding of the Voting Rights Act such that, no, unless it's an extraordinary situation where you can meet all of these standards, de facto impossible to meet them, really. No, the Voting Rights Act is really not going to require that you take race into account to create black majority districts, Latino majority districts, whatever. That's out the door. And in fact, the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause will often forbid taking race into account. I mean, the court has long held that, but always balanced it with that understanding of the Voting Rights Act, and you had to sort of figure it out between the two. Here they're like, no, we're going to resolve this in the other direction. We're going to give primacy to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, generally forbidding taking race into account in drawing these lines. And we're going to rule that the Voting Rights Act, except in extraordinary cases that probably don't exist, it's never going to require that you create majority-minority electoral districts. Republicans are thrilled by that, right? These southern states are going back and going, great, we have these black majority districts, let's get rid of them. Let's get rid of them. Make them all white majority. And so critics might say, no, they are taking race into account to benefit white people. But what Republicans are going to argue, probably successfully in front of this Supreme Court, is that, no, we're not even thinking about race. We're just thinking about political party. We're just trying to advantage the Republican Party and stick it to the Democratic Party. Right? And there's a case for that. But the problem in many ways, right, is especially in the South, is that if you're targeting Democrats for disfavorable treatment in the South, you're targeting black people to a substantial degree. And if you're seeking to advantage the Republican Party in the South, you're essentially seeking to advantage white people. I don't think this court, is going to buy that argument. They'll say, unless you have evidence of racial animus, racial motivation in these redrawing of boundaries, which you're almost never going to find that smoking gun, because legislators aren't stupid when they're doing this. They're told not to talk about race, ever. Just leave it out of the conversation. I think the court's going to say, well, unless you can find smoking gun evidence of open racial discrimination by intent, we're just not going to buy that argument. So, quick update in terms of both executive branch sort of reinterpretations of civil rights. That's always an ongoing conversation. And an ongoing sort of an agenda by the U.S. Supreme Court to revise their understanding, in particular, of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All right.